Heyo! Welcome to another Team SNG tutorial. Today we are going to be talking about designing a deck to go first and designing a deck to go second. What we're going to do is we're not going to necessarily go into the nitty-gritty of, hey, you must play these cards in going first, and hey, you must play these cards in going second. What we're going to talk about is decks that are designed to go first and decks that are designed to go second. And how do you decide what works for you? That being said, I'd like to ask you guys, do leave us a like, leave us a comment, leave us a subscribe. And if you have a deck that you love already, but you're not necessarily sure about side decking, link up above and down below to a video that teaches you the basics of side decking. What kind of things do you want to do if you're going first? Well, if you're going first, you're possibly playing one of two different kinds of decks. You're either playing a control deck that aims to stop your opponent from doing what they want, and does it in a way that creates a grind game, forcing your opponent to play through several turns and hopefully outpace them in the long run. Or you're playing a deck that's a bit of a marathon, that's actually coming out to play for turn 3. The whole point isn't to win on turn 2, because obviously you don't go turn 2, but it's to stall your opponent so that on turn 3 you can OTK them. Because maybe your deck doesn't do well in the grind game, but it does put your opponent in a situation where their deck can't do what they want. So now you know if your deck wants to control, or if your deck wants to control to OTK. Typically, these are the two main going first strategies. If you've got a deck that is all about turboing out boss monster on top of boss monster on top of boss monster, then you definitely have a going first deck, because the whole thing is about turboing out these boss monsters with little to no interruption. If you've got a deck that is about stunning your opponent, controlling the board state so that you can win on turn 8, 9, 10, 12, but continuously control the board, then again, you have a going first deck. Typically, you're going to want to set up your stuns and you're going to want to set up the things to slow your opponent down early in a way that will continue to allow you to gain advantage over the game. Either one of these are options of how to play going first. Now, obviously, there are lots of ways to play going first. You could create an interesting lock like Tenyi does, or you could create a big board with lots of boss monsters like Karakuri does. These are ways of knowing that your deck wants to go first. If your deck doesn't want to go first, then your deck wants to go second. Personally, I like going second. Your deck going second is going to do several different things. The first of those is break a board and OTK. So, the Fallen of Albaz deck that I played at the Remote Duel Extravaganza, which will be up on the channel next week, so make sure you leave us a subscribe to see it, is all about OTKing your opponent and ending the game real quick. You end it on turn 2, you run over them. Another way of playing going second is something like Ancient Warriors, that uses different kinds of removal to stop your opponent's board. If your opponent has set up a board with lots of monsters, big boss monsters that they're hoping to stick around for a few turns, or at least for turn 3 so they can beat you turn 3, Ancient Warriors is an example of a deck that says, nah, I'm not having any of that, and just systematically shrinks the board down. And again, it's an example of a deck that wants to go second. Now, Ancient Warriors is a bit of a difference because it can go first or go second. If your deck's got an interesting assortment of ways to remove things from your opponent, or cards that take advantage of your opponent having built a board, then you're in a situation where you're probably going to want to go second. If you're in a situation where your deck is all about putting big monsters out on the field, ignoring your opponent's plays, potentially breaking the board getting there, then again, you're going to want to go second, but this time, you're going to OTK. You're not necessarily going to OTK with the break a board mentality. Your hopes there are that your opponent has used a lot of resources to get to the board, and you're just going to systematically dismantle that. Meaning that they can't play turn 3 and turn 4 because you've gotten rid of what they wanted to do and they managed to do on turn 1. And they've expended too many resources doing it. In the case of an OTK deck, such as this, you're going to want to put bodies on board and break your opponent's board at the same time. Now, this might seem like the best option. However, typically doing this, you're not going to be able to play the resource game. You're often going to find yourself with very few cards in hand, if any, and if your opponent does survive the turn, you're often going to find yourself getting OTK'd following it. So, that's talked about going first and going second. But we have sort of mentioned decks that can do both in Ancient Warriors. Another example of a deck that can do both is Crusadia Mech Knight. Deck list for this is featured right here. This deck was featured on the channel and is actually one of my favorite decks to play. This deck can go first and it can go second, and it can do it so well. The reason this deck can go first is it can use its Crusadia engine to climb all the way up to your Avermax. And Avermax is a very, very powerful card that then forces your opponent to deal with it. So let's talk about this deck real quick as an example of what can go first and second. So, as stated, going first, you can go into Mech Knight Crusadia Avermax. That'll allow you to force your opponent to play on your terms. Your opponent now has to deal with Avermax before he can deal with anything else. The other thing this deck can do going first is it can play the World Legacy Spell Trap lineup to control what your opponent is going to do. Using cards like World Legacy Whispers, World Legacy Key, and World Legacy Secrets, you can control what your opponent does in any given column. So long as you can find a way to get your Mech Knight engine up and running and onto the board. This is what you're going to want to do going first. Going second, you have a few options. You can lean into your Crusadia engine and stop at Equimax, punishing your opponent for putting monsters on the board that you can easily remove and certainly run over. The other benefit to this deck is you can, once again, lean into your Mech Knights to give your Equimax a power boost and potentially play for turn 4 if you are forced to go second. The other benefit of going second with this deck is that your opponent will have set columns up for you, so you're not going to be limited to whatever columns you can set up on your own as you would be going first. So this deck can do both going first and going second. It has a win condition for both. One win condition is OTK. The other win condition is limiting your opponent. So this is an example of a going first and going second deck. Another example of a deck that can do this, we've already spoken about in Ancient Warriors. This deck has the ability to play on your opponent's turn, meaning that you can play more control game using the new Link 2 that recently came out in Rise of the Duelist. The Link 2 triggers off other Ancient Warrior card effects, such as your Sun Ma-O and your Graceful Shugong, giving you the ability to control what your opponent does if you are forced to go first. And again, going second, this deck plays power cards like Gamma Seal and Loyal Guan Yung. These cards help you break your opponent's board and push for game. On top of them, you've got cards like your Fearsome Zhang Yuan and even your Ambitious Chow Dai, which can help you push for game and OTK your opponent, assuming you can break through their board. So going first, you lean on your cards that control the board state, and going second, you lean on the power cards that stop your opponent dead in their tracks and potentially OTK them. That being said, we've talked about going first decks, we've talked about going second decks, and finally we've talked about decks that can do both. Decks that can do both typically do a lot better in tournaments due to the fact that your opponent can't necessarily force you to go off turn. And that can definitely give you an edge. If your deck can do both, you're probably in good shape, because it doesn't matter if you lose or win the dice roll. If your deck can't do both, then you definitely need to think about side decking for the off turn. And to learn about that, check out the video right here. And with that being said, thanks for watching. Leave us a like, leave us a comment, leave us a subscribe, and I'll see you guys at the next video.